I'm going to be talking about Melvin Charney. Charney was a Montreal-based artist, architect, and author. He was extremely active and vocal within the Montreal architecture community. His career as an architectural critic was as important and as productive as his artistic practice. Over the course of 50 years, Charney published dozens of essays and academic journals in art and architecture, which were recently compiled into an anthology edited by Louis Martin, to which much of my research is indebted. Although Charney published and exhibited internationally, his work was always grounded locally in the relationship between the architectural and political histories of Montreal. So for my paper today, I'm going to be looking at one brief period early in his career where his short-lived affinity for technology overlapped his interest in vernacular architecture and local politics that resulted in what I've called a techno-populist approach to architecture. So in 1966, Melvin Charney entered an architectural design competition for the Canadian Pavilion at Expo 70 in Osaka, Japan. His submission, a collaborative project with architect Harry Parnasse, was a self-erecting exhibition system, a matrix-like structure to be built from tower cranes, steel masts, and prefabricated modules that left the mechanics of the building exposed and celebrated. The materials used to build the pavilion were the same materials of which it was composed. The shipping containers used for transportation would be appropriated as versatile building elements, and the tower cranes were left in place as structural beams. The entire frame was adjustable. The towers could be changed in height, and modules could be added to accommodate changing needs. This adaptability opened the structure to input for exhibit designers, artists, and administrators. Without access to cybernetic technology, his solution to make the pavilion flexible to users was to offer multiple tiers of engagement. Visitors could follow different circuits through the pavilion, a fast trip via the main observation platforms, a medium-length visit of the exhibit from extended platforms, and a slow, detailed visit giving the option to explore exhibits in depth or change circuits and make a quick escape. The pavilion was designed so that the various units of this so-called kit of parts could be easily dismantled and repurposed when the exhibition was over. Although Charney's project did not win the competition, his proposal was widely recognized within the architectural community, with articles published in Architectural Design, Progressive Architecture, and a feature in Raina Bonham's classic book on Architecture of the Era, Megastructure, Urban Futures of the Recent Past. As Bonham points to in this text, Charney's design is emblematic of an international phenomenon in avant-garde architecture that culminated in the 1960s, known as megastructure. The term megastructure was coined by Japanese architect Fumihiko Maki, who describes it as a large frame in which all functions of a city or part of a city are housed. It has been made possible by present-day technology, and in a sense, it is a man-made feature of the landscape. Mackey's definition points to the intent to integrate all structures of urban life, architecture, landscape, and technology into one environmental system. Architects from all over the world engaged in this approach. British megastructure group Archigram produced dozens of conceptual drawings of techno-utopian cityscapes, including the well-known Walking City and Plug-in City projects from 1963. Dutch artist Constance New Babylon was a concept for an anti-capitalist playground that drew on situationist space-forming tactics to free its ludic citizens from the trials of everyday life. Cedric Price and Joan Littlewood conceived of an idea for a theater that would be in dialogue with its audience, transforming the user and the architecture itself into active participants. Japanese architects, Kenzo Tange and a group known as the Metabolists, embraced the megastructure as a method for rehabilitating the nation after the atomic bomb. Tange and the Metabolists would go on to lead the design for Expo 70 in Osaka, for which Charney's exhibition system was designed. But Charney didn't have to look far to find megastructure inspiration. He worked with engineer Jonas Barkas who contributed to the man of the, sorry, this is the wrong slide. I'm missing one, that's okay. The Man the Producer Pavilion at Expo 67 that Bonham called an expo within itself. That's not this, I'm missing this slide just so you know. You probably recognize this as Pavilion, which Charney marveled at the enormity of and called it a town within itself. In formulating his design, Charney's greatest creative influence can be found in Montreal's grain elevators. While there were some formal similarities between the two projects, Charney urges that in an essay from 1967 that the grain elevators should not be taken up as formal images. Rather, it is the process by which they are an image that is important. This process we must study if we believe that architecture is an involvement with human processes rather than with designed things. Oh, there it is. This is Man the producer. So, for Charney, the significance of these megastructural designs, so that was all published in, never mind. Going back, okay. So for Charney, the significance of these megastructural designs lay in their involvement with a physical organization that acknowledges human action and a new scale of individualization, and for creating situations where the inhabitants will be able to participate in the specific placemaking of their own microenvironments. Charney's own optimism toward the liberatory potential of technology reached its peak in his editorial statement of a special issue of Parallel published in March 1967. Here, Charney wrote a kind of techno-utopian manifesto on the idea of urbland, a new model of urban design predicted to succeed the current megalopolises of New York City and Tokyo. In this new urban system, architecture would be disinterested in what things would look like. It is a new urban system, and this new urban system, architecture will be, it is concerned with the possible organization of the new environment. In addition, rather than having design centralized, citizens will become architects and actively participate in making of the kind of place in which we live. It is not only design that was decentralized. In Charney's Urbland, this new environment would embody a post-totalitarian spirit where the distinctions are redefined and utopias are no longer imaginary. I have no idea what the murder syndrome is, by the way. Doesn't sound very utopian to me, but so far from the ultimate realization of the seamless interactive architecture of Urbland, Charney's proposal for Expo 70 is something closer to a very rudimentary prototype. The originality of Charney's proposal within Canadian architecture becomes especially clear in comparison to other designs submitted to the competition. While some of them were beautiful and inventive, including the winning design by Arthur Erickson, which you can see here built, these designs all exhibit a tendency to think of architecture as a formal image rather than a system of human processes. A surprising number of the designs were kind of underwhelming brutalist structures that tried to compensate with tropes of Canadian nationalism, so enormous Canadian flags, excessive uses of wood, or sometimes these kind of modern reconfigurations of igloo or teepee type structures, and a lot of totem pole signage situations. In contrast, Charney's design is void of any nationalistic fervor. The only symbolic reference to Canada mentioned in his proposal was, quote, the 11 masts that carry the heraldry of the 11 territories of Canada. However, in 1966, Canada in fact had 10 provinces and 2 territories, making 12. It's possible that I'm misinterpreting his definition of territories, or that this was a sincere miscalculation on his part, but I think that it is far more likely that the missing territory is Quebec, and this subtle omission was an indicator of Charney's political affiliations. In researching this project, I've often questioned whether Charney's proposal was submitted in earnest or a subversive poke at the Canadian government. By reducing the pavilion to a scant frame, he not only rejects monumentally formally, but also symbolically. He resists aggrandizing the political body that the pavilion represents. This hypothesis is supported by the fact that 2 years later, Charney responds to another design competition with the Canadian Air Force Memorial, proposing the complete dematerialization of architecture and to artifacts, or so-called memos, that overtly criticizes the government's glorification of war. So moving into the early 70s, Charney became more overt in his political interests. While this coincided with his declining interest in technology, I do not see this relationship as cause and effect. I would argue that Charney's engagement with technology in the 1960s is as representative of his personal politics and the state of politics in Montreal as is later in his career. The consistent trajectory of his politics can be best traced through his relentless championing of vernacular architecture. This interest started at the very beginning of his career. While in school at Yale, Charney was inspired by the work of Louis I. Kahn. Like Kahn, Charney sought to discover the essence of architecture and believed it could be found in the vernacular constructions of ancient indigenous cultures. In an essay about the Friuli of Apulia in Italy, Charney expresses his pessimistic view of their existence in the future. Quote, vernacular traditions represent, for the most part, pre-technological methods that have persisted until now despite industrialization, and it is inevitable that they will be replaced by the products of a central design office. Back in Montreal, Charney laments a similar condition in which vernacular architecture in Montreal is being torn down to make room for modern developments. In the aptly titled essay, An Old Montreal That No One Wants to Preserve, Charney romantically describes the details of Montreal's unique vernacular aesthetic, concluding that our buildings, thin-skinned, anonymous, endless, affirm our lives. It's clear in these texts that Charney has succumbed to the idea that a technological invasion of architecture worldwide was unavoidable, and so the only way to preserve those vernacular traditions was to use technology itself. Through his studies of vernacular architecture abroad, combined with the philosophy of Michael Polanyi on the tacit dimension of knowledge, Charney was led to the belief that people possessed an innate knowledge of architecture that could continue to be practiced within technology. Thus, Charney advocated for the use of new technologies in architecture, not simply to modernize, but to preserve vernacular traditions, encouraging building based on tacit knowledge and in turn produce a new form of popular architecture. I would further this argument and state that the impetus to empower the citizens of Quebec to use technology to reclaim their traditions and individuality and assert themselves as actors within the environment is directly tied to the politics of the Quiet Revolution. This is an approach that I've identified as techno-populist, and that Charney intends to use technology and architecture to facilitate political empowerment among a specific population toward a specific political goal. To be clear, the Quiet Revolution was a period of significant cultural change, rapid modernization, secularization, and fierce political activism that unfolded over the course of the decade. During this time, the citizens of Quebec began pushing for political independence from Canada, and the urgency for them to be self-deterministic and take control of their environment politically, spatially, and culturally was tangible. There has been substantial literature produced on the many dimensions of this complex socio-political moment in Quebec history, but of particular interest to my research is a book recently published entitled The Empire Within. In this text, author Charney outlines the controversial history of how Montreal activists forward liberally from the emerging post-colonial theory as a colony and Montreal as a colonial city. For Québécois, the descendants of French settlers who colonized Aboriginal populations upon their settlement in North America, to claim to be colonized themselves is undoubtedly problematic. Yet, at a base level, Québécois activists and colonized peoples shared a common principle. They demanded to become the active subjects rather than the passive objects of history. To quote Mills, in the 1960s, people the world over were asserting their right to be active creators of the world in which they lived. This struggle was not conceived of as an attempt to go back to a previous age of glory before colonization, or to turn back the forces of modernity. Rather, activists and intellectuals worked to construct a counter-modernity, an alternative society in which citizens would be able to control the forces that shaped their lives. Here, Mills is referring to the reconstruction of the socio-political structures of society. However, this rhetoric was mirrored in the field of architecture, and the question of how social objectives could be progressed through the manipulations of the physical structure of society was on the minds of architects all over the world, and still is. Bonham argued that megastructures had enjoyed a period of dominance because they offered to make sense of an architecturally incomprehensible condition in the world cities to resolve the conflicts between design and spontaneity, the large and the small, the permanent and the transient. Megastructural forms allow not only a flexible space, but a more flexible ideology that could be reinterpreted for different objectives. For Charney, architecture was simply a means to a political end. His particular brand of architectural techno-optimism was imbued with the populist sentiments of the Quiet Revolution in 1960s Quebec. Rather than building static forms, Charney sought to use technology to produce a new vernacular, an architecture, that would stimulate Quebecois' tacit knowledge, engage them as citizen architects, and in turn empower them politically.